And I'll appreciate if the authors go ahead and mention their books if they would like. And having a little mythology discussion here. Hyro's supposed to send us in a couple of questions, and he's a person that's new to the skeptic movement, and I think it's best to get some kind of general questions from people like that, you know. So anyway, we can talk about whatever we want to. I just want to say a few things about New Skeptics. We promote scientific literacy and biblical literacy, and we practice humanism. And we do this through a process of reason, logic, and science. So that's what New Skeptics is about. June 6th, at 6 p.m. Pacific, we will have Raphael Lataster, who is #1 in religious philosophy with There Was No Jesus, There Is No God, in discussion with Randall Rouser, a great international debater. And so that's part of the global religious discussion that New Skeptics wants to promote. And so there we have it.
Question, Phil, did you see if you could get Dr. Price to join that, or are you still interested in that?
Did in fact join it. The fact is, most notable people, and we grabbed some of the best Christ myth scholars. Now, those who spoke literally that they joined the organization include David Fitzgerald, Raphael Lataster, Zoltan Istvan, who is a United States presidential candidate, who will be doing the New Skeptics show, by the way. Okay, he wrote The Transhumanist Wager, which was a great book. Okay, now Dr. Price was one of the top 3, but anyway, we support the work also of Richard Carrier. Now, while he hasn't verbally signed on with us, that's really just a matter of his not being communicated to enough because he just, frankly, doesn't have time for it. Okay, is what it is. But we support his work, and we support the work also of, let's see, it's David Fitzgerald, Raphael Lataster, Robert M. Price, Richard Carrier, and Neil Godfrey, who is David Fitzgerald is recommending for an award right now. And speaking of awards, I want to get in that Lawrence Krauss, who is going to do the New Skeptic show at some point, won the American Humanist Association Humanist of the Year. Okay, and he's a favorite educator of mine. So I just want to get those things in there. So anyway, that answers your question, but it helped me get out a lot of info. Thank you.
Yeah, just wondering specifically if he had responded about the June 6th hangout.
Oh, the June 6th hangout? No, he would. That's like a debate, but it's a discussion. It's less formal. Okay.
Yeah, I think he prefers that anyway. He's not really into debate.
Well, I'm just saying that's what between Raphael and Randall, and then New Skeptics hopes to feature similar discussions. And hopefully someday we'll have Raphael and William Lane Craig on New Skeptics or something like that. Okay, so we actually are hoping to engage the global religious debate, and Raphael, that's what he's doing his PhD on. In fact, is William Lane Craig and the global religious debate. So he's finishing that while teaching at Sydney University. And anyway, what I wanted to talk about, I tell you what's a great, y'all are welcome to suggest topics, and then we can let people who are knowledgeable in those topics talk about them, and I'll just try to moderate that. Sounds like a reasonable approach to me. So Deanne Boswell, what are you reading? What are you working on? But I'm going to say my topic, though, well, let me get it in, is Roman cults and how they relate to Christianity. That's a big subject of interest for me right now.
Yeah, my interests are along the same lines, though more specifically in the Egyptian religion. I'm more well read on that and its relation to Christianity, Judeo-Christianity. As far as what I'm working on these days, I'm just trying to get a blog up and going that will kind of advertise for my book, which we've covered on a previous episode of your New Skeptics chat, which was the Amen Creed. I've actually put that on private at the moment. I'm only hosting it on Scribd so that I can revise some things, some small errors here and there that I've noticed, and then I'll have that back up, which just kind of covers what we just talked about, just kind of and in a satirical fashion, because I used to be a big church goer, and I even used to be a missionary and a Sunday school teacher. So I kind of approach that book as though I'm an apologist. I use apologist lingo, but I'm trying to defend the old Egyptian faith in that respect. So it's satirical in its narration style, but when it comes to citing the sources to demonstrate possibilities of influence, it's all business there. So the citation should check out for anyone who wants to delve into that. But yeah, so ever since then, that's all I've been doing is trying to get a blog up and going that will kind of help advertise for that book.
Okay. Roman cults. Well, here's okay. The Osirians. Okay. Are you studying the context between Egyptian religion and then how it was expressed in Rome with the Osirian cult?
Well, yeah, because the ISIS more so than Osiris during the Roman era, but yeah, the ISIS cult was huge during the Roman times, and I think it's in fact who was it? Dr. Glenn Holland, who stated that the ISIS cult was actually the most widespread and pervasive cult during the Roman era. So even more so than Christianity. I mean, Christianity would obviously go on to surpass in popularity, but during the time of Roman Egypt, yeah, the ISIS cult was the most widespread throughout the Roman Empire and the most popular.
I see. Now, isn't there? Here's a question: baptism, because that's one of those things in Christianity. It's the scholars use that authenticity, how they make things authentic, and this is the dual differentiation. You've got double differentiation. In other words, this baptism, as it's practiced, does not seem to come from Judaism or the major pagan religions, but is rather more of a mystery cult phenomenon.
Yeah, I would say I could agree with that. At least from what I've read.
How would it relate to Egyptian religion is what I'm asking you. Do we have an Egyptian baptism, or is it more like a purification? That's what I'm asking.
Well, they did have purification rituals that involved water, but as far as like within the Christian context, and specifically with how Paul elaborates on baptism, saying that it's a symbolism of Christ's death, his burial, and then his resurrection. When you go down into the water and you come back up, you're buried with Christ, and then you're raised again into the newness of life. And all of that involving the submersion of water, it does have a parallel in ancient Egyptian religion. We could hash over semantics as to whether it should be referred to as baptism. I know some people may find that to be an issue, but I'd say as far as what the actual ritual represented, I would say there is a definite parallel there, and it's what Egyptologists call apotheosis by drowning. Because I'm sure a lot of people here in the room are familiar with the Osiris myth in general, that it involved him being locked up in a casket by his brother Seth, and then he was thrown into the Nile River, or in effect buried in the Nile River, and he drowned. And so in times after that myth, anyone who drowned in the Nile was considered to have had a sacred death, and that when they resurrected in the underworld, they were glorified like Osiris because they died in the same manner that Osiris did. So this was referred to as apotheosis by drowning. That, in other words, like being buried in the waters like Osiris caused you to also resurrect in the underworld like Osiris and then become a god like Osiris.
I think you've nailed it. I think you've nailed it right there. And by apotheosis, we mean the becoming of the god. This is divinization. This is imitatio Dei, right? That's the principle we're dealing with.
Correct.
In dying and rising, you become like the god, and you're imitating the god. Then, and this is what's happening in Egyptian religion and in Christianity.
We should just all crucify ourselves then. The middle part.
And sadly, some people still do that to this day.
That's
I think it's in the. I think I've heard that it's in the Philippines, that's still a big cult practice, is to actually have people literally undergo crucifixion each year during the Easter time, have themselves literally nailed to a cross.
There's really bloody rituals worldwide that way. There's a guy right here in my town that drags himself up and down the street on Good Friday with a cross. He dresses like Jesus. It's like 6 or 8 mile walk, up the sidewalk, like a crazy man.
Huh.
Crown of thorns, whole bit, bloody face.
Well, at least he's dedicated to his cause. I'll give him that much.
That's something a lot of standard Christians don't seem to get, is that what they are doing is taking on the spiritual body, which belongs to Jesus. Okay, and by imitating Christ, they do this. But it seems to me that the way the Gospel of Mark was first written, Jesus actually is a person, or he represents a person attaining to this, and so he represents the cult member himself, and that's how this imitation is expressed.
Yeah, I'm not the research guy. You guys are fascinated. I'm just here to listen and learn.
Well, what's John Felix doing? In fact, I have a John F. Felix story. I'm not sure if I should tell it or not. John, should I tell this story? See there? Getting coffee.
So what it is, you should like private message me and ask.
Well, now you have to tell. You can't just tease it without.
Yeah, I'm interested too, because I don't think I had any stories.
No, I saw John when I was a kid. John and I are from the same small town in Indiana, okay, which is bizarre. But that's actually true. I had been reading Robert M. Price when I came across John as his producer.
Yeah, it's amazing. I just thought that was just so incredible.
Yeah,
I had forgotten about that.
It's a
little
small
Jungian synchronicity.
Right. But anyway, I saw John when I was a kid, and somebody had pointed him out because of his political beliefs, and I said, "Nah, we don't have any people like that around here." I
was pretty leftist when I was a kid, even very young.
But I do remember seeing John once when I was a kid, and so that's really that was weird. I had to flash back to that, but I seem to have a pretty good memory for faces from childhood.
And, it seems strange that a small town like we grew up in, or one of the towns I grew up in, that you wouldn't know about somebody or ever meet them,
Right. Yeah, that's true. There's not a lot of big religious discussion going on in the restaurants of Northwest Indiana. It happens, but you really got to know somebody. Because, it's like, what do they say publicly? Don't talk about religion in a bar. They mean in a bar, in a restaurant, in a social environment of any sort, really. And in fact, so that's the rule. That's why we're all so brilliant when it comes to religion.
Well, in Indiana, the bars are like, you might sit down and a guy might be sitting there and says, "Hey, you want to go and have a fist fight?" Just because he wants to get knocked around a bit or something, or knock somebody else around, and then shake hands afterward. That's just the kind of place you grew up in,
Well, we're talking about Roman cults, John, for one thing. Now, I noticed, like, the cult of Eleusis was, again, a presence in Rome. And it had the lower mysteries and the higher mysteries, and we don't know too much about it, but apparently they used to do wild drugs and things in the, well, of course, the Dionysians, I guess they would do pretty much anything.
Yeah, there's some controversy about what exactly do we know about these mysteries. Some of that stuff that we've taken for granted as being well documented actually is not that well documented, but I can't name names or scholars off the top of my head. But it seems to be the state of scholarship nowadays is that a lot of the firm foundations that a lot of previous scholarship was based on starts to get a little bit shaky, and so I guess it's the effect of postmodernism in general.
Okay. It seems also to me, I mean, we've got to mention, and I'm sure it gets mentioned a lot, but there's a big religious bias. There's a big Christian bias. Someone like Robert M. Price, who is an atheist Bible scholar, is kind of a rare bird. Is that not true?
Yeah, because it's the cognitive dissonance of those words you just said could cause somebody's head to explode, I think. Or I used to have on Facebook where you put your religion. I don't even know if they have that on Facebook anymore, but I used to put Roman Catholic atheist, and people would get really upset. They would get mad about that.
Yeah, and you were trying to compromise. You were trying to compromise. What do you get?
Because you spend all your life in religion because of your upbringing, and it still clings to you through family and friends and things like that. So really, it was like a secret little time bomb I planted there just to see what would happen if I did that, because I did it deliberately, and it just caused me so much grief that I had to take it out. If I had just put Roman Catholic or just put atheist, I don't think anybody would have cared. But to combine the two, no, that was.
Let's talk about something ordinary folks might be familiar with: the Eucharist. John, if you're Catholic, you should know more about the Eucharist than all of us, right?
Probably.
Yeah, I'm a Protestant.
Well, anyway, what's going on there?
Well.
As
you know, Catholics like to claim that they're the only ones that actually have God physically present in their churches. There's, they have these chapels. They're called devotional chapels, Eucharistic, perpetual devotion, and there's manned 24 hours a day by volunteers. That somebody's there at all times. There's a consecrated host in the chapel, and people are just off the street can go in there and sit down and meditate, pray. But you have to think of it as you're physically sitting in the same room with God, and it's like they really pride themselves in that kind of thing. Okay. And
so you're down
at unique.
Our Lady of Perpetual Drama. You're down at the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Drama, and now they got the Eucharist going, and they got the wine and stuff. They really put it on.
Yeah, they take it literally, that, and it's the way they see it as a direct continuity with the Old Testament. That every Catholic church has the little thing called a tabernacle behind the altar, and it's literally supposed to be modeled after the Jewish tabernacle. So it looks like a metal box that looks a lot like a tent, and they keep consecrated hosts inside there, and they bring them out, for distribution, for communion and stuff like that. But they claim that, the Catholic Church is a direct heir to the Old Testament tabernacle, temple, where the presence of Yahweh is actually physically there.
Okay. Well, that's an important point. And now, what are the bread and wine symbolizing?
Really, it's not a symbol. It's literally the body and blood of Jesus, that through the medium of the priest, he doesn't actually put the whammy on it. It's not like magic or supposed to be. But as a mediator, the power of Christ is channeled through him to change, in a metaphysical way, I guess, the bread and water into the actual body and blood of Jesus Christ. So that's why they would say that's physically there.
He's saying in the Bible that he is the bread, right? He's talking about himself being bread. Now,
right, they take that literally.
That goes back to, again, we're talking crop cycle stuff, okay? And this is on a psychological level. This is the old sacrifice to the food animal and the crop gods, the corn god, the grain god of some kind. They're ubiquitous throughout the world.
Yeah, I would say you're spot on. I think all this stuff, even in other religions too, all descend from earlier forms. And by the time that they're incorporated in whatever rituals, they might have forgotten their origins, but examining them, and I know DN does a lot of this, examining the earlier and primary meanings of a lot of these myths that have now been used by other religions. Because some people say that, have tried to maintain that, for instance, there's like a cannibalistic type ritual at the basis of things like communion and that. Well, if there was, it was way in the past, and the people that were doing it were probably not aware and would be offended if you suggested that that was possibly the origin of what they're doing. But comparative mythology will tell you a lot of the origins of this stuff, and it's very ancient.
Right, but now the Dionysians, certainly with their ritual, and their wine their god is the god of wine, Bacchus Dionysus, and so how does that relate then to the Christ myth?
It's probably synchronicity, where emerging Christianity incorporated a lot of the mystery religious aspects, mainly as a convert kind of thing, you know, or people brought different things with them when they joined Christianity.
Okay, I'm thinking Jesus is saying, you know, I'm the true vine, because people already know Bacchus is the vine. Things like this, right? Isn't that so, Deanne? It looks like you're responding to that.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that assessment. In fact, I think it was Diodorus of Sicily who explicitly stated that the myth of Bacchus, that the vine, the grapevine, was literally the body of Bacchus. That Bacchus in his mythology was just a symbol of the grapevine itself.
Right. So again, we're in crop cycle fertility symbols and wealth, plenty type symbols, and this is kind of what our ideas of heaven are built out of, I think. And it's an entheogen. Now, we didn't talk about that, and that was something I was going to mention with the Eleusinians, is that they could be taking mushrooms or whatever.
Yeah, there's mushrooms, and there's also some kind of elixir that did involve wine as one of its ingredients. I forget the name of the elixir, but it involved a few other ingredients that, like, all put together would induce like psychedelic hallucinations. Which, of course, you're going to see God when you're you're going to meet Bacchus when you have those kind of.
That's the point, isn't it?
There's a guy that was quoted in D.M. Murdoch Acharya's book, Sons of God, and I had interviewed him for an article that I had done, and he wrote a book called, or a pamphlet actually, about the cannibalistic Christians, about how his theory was that people like John the Baptist and so forth, when they died, they were kept, their bodies were kept, and various psychedelic funguses had grown on the bodies. They would eat these funguses and have visionary experiences about the dead leader, and supposedly that was something that was at the basis of a remembered kind of thing. Excuse me, remembered kind of thing about the early origins of Christianity and its various communities. The visions that they were experiencing were psychedelic visions from mushrooms from actual dead bodies. So you're literally eating the flesh of the leader, the founder.
Exactly. Yeah. There's that the John Allegro thesis, but there was also air god.
I don't think we had anything about dead bodies. I think the dead bodies thing was not Allegro's idea, but you know, I'm not aware of any fungus that grows on corpses that make you stuck.
Yeah, not on corpses, but we were going back to the bread thing and the usage of bread. There's a fungus that will infect certain types of bread grains, which is called ergot, I think, and I think it actually even produces a chemical that is went on to be the basis of LSD, and that's why it'll induce similar visions to what LSD will do. But actually, I was actually watching an old rerun of Ripley's Believe It or Not the other day, and Jack Palance was telling that exact story about that's what spawned the hysteria of the Salem witch trials, was that people were actually eating a bad batch of bread that was infected with ergot, and that's why they were tripping out and having visions, and people thought that they were possessed by devils and had been hexed by witches, and that's what started the whole Salem hysteria. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I think a similar thing happened at Haight-Ashbury in the 60s. I'm just kidding. Okay, anyway.
Who's the first guy to try dead body fungus? That's what I don't know.
All right, and this dead body, again, this is the hunt animal normally. I mean, this is the food god. Okay, so if you put this in a tribal context, you would have them doing something which is more like a tribal dance or song or something, and there's to whatever their food animal was. And that's what this is represented, and it just takes new forms. What I wanted to say about mythology, really to everyone, is that you have to look at it as something that's been going on maybe 50,000, maybe 100,000 years. And we can see myths going along with people through the migrations in the world and changing their form to adapt to a new environment. And I think that's a fascinating way to look at myth. Another thing is to look at what the modern world is. And we're a theoretical society. Societies used to run on mythic narratives like we have in the Gospels and in the Bible, all the holy books of the world. That's what societies are based upon. And it's just unfortunate that people confuse the map with the territory, and I think lose a little bit of their humanity by clicking up in religions and kind of turning against other people. At least it seems that way from my point of view.
Yeah, I believe it was Joseph Campbell who said that if a myth is translated into literal fact, then the myth is a lie. But if you read it as a reflection of the world inside you, then it's a truth, like a penultimate, like archetypal type of truth.
Yeah.
But that's the main point, though. If you take it literally, then yeah, it's just a lie that just freaks out.
Okay. Well, speaking of this, in fact, Campbell, chthonic symbols. In fact, John and you are great people to talk about this. The serpent, something like the serpent and the moon. I mean, Campbell goes all the way, and he gets quite Jungian in his interpretation of this. And you know, I mean, that's all. It rests it rests pretty heavily on theory to be entirely valid in every case. In other words, is the serpent always the penis, or whatever? Right. I mean, is a cigar ever really just a cigar?
Yeah.
Now it's Freudian there. I like Joseph Campbell, and I've watched a lot of his things, but I have a problem with Jungian archetypical collective unconsciousness kind of things. A lot of symbols, I think, are just because they evoke the same kind of things when humans of different cultures see them. For instance, you know, serpents can be thought of as symbols of eternal life because they shed their skins, and that's not something that needs to be shared as an unconscious collective kind of archetype. That's something that could be just, you know, a coincidence. And there could also be some things that are based on the material wiring of the human brain. For instance, like similar near-death experience type stuff. And because of just the way that the physical setup of the brain is, I don't want to be a reductionist, but I tend to look down upon a little bit Jungian perspectives because they seem to kind of go off into the metaphysical.
And DN, were you responding?
Kind of, but not really. Just going to comment. I'm not actually familiar with Jung's work. I just hear it kind of, you know, referred to in these kind of discussions of this sort. But whenever I hear the term collective unconscious, I never actually like interpreted it as any kind of metaphysics. Now I've heard that abused in like New Age circles and shit. Like the 100th monkey syndrome, that we're all like connected on some kind of spiritual level or some kind of vibrational frequency level. But whenever I've heard it like used in like scientific papers or psychological books and things like that, I'd always understood the collective unconscious to just kind of be like exactly what John had just elaborated on, but just using that word to describe it. Like we all share the same type of brain structure, we all share the same type of DNA, and that's the collective unconscious, that overlapping map that is behind our our DNA. It's not that we're all like connected on some kind of supernatural level or something. It's that we all have similar brains, and so when we see similar things in nature, we're going to interpret those in similar ways with similar themes.
Agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. The only thing I don't know about a lot is how Campbell conceives of it. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good background in his work.
Again, remember, this is going on for a long time. So what you're talking about are two different processes. There's the process of diffusion, where one culture borrows the myths of another culture. And we all know, certainly recognize that going back through Christianity and through Judaism to Babylon and Canaan and all of this. So you've got diffusion, and then you've got individual discovery, which is what DN was talking about, where we all have the same sort of brain and we're going to interpret similar symbols. But here's what the thing is. Humans have been going all over the earth, and they have been traveling in ships and everything like that. So it's really always hard to rule out diffusion of the idea from a neighboring mythology into your mythology.
There's plenty of examples of completely competing symbology, even though we do have the collective unconscious, which is undeniable. But the whole Yazidi phenomenon of the peacock angel being seen as a satanic symbol to some Abrahamic religions, Islam in particular, I guess, is their creator god. So here we have the opposite effect too.
Yeah, and symbols and tropes and various things go from one culture to another, they change. So as they're spreading, they may take on different connotations, including negative connotations.
Right. I'm going to say those online Yale courses are a great source. Christine Hayes does those, and she covers Old Testament topics really, really well. So you get a good idea as to the background that's coming out of there. And it's interesting, what you're seeing with Greece is kind of an extension. It's the new country coming west of the Orient, where all the knowledge really had been in the world previous to that.
Right. Kind of adding on to the point that John just made, that as your environment changes, when a people migrates out to a different environment, the same type of symbol will be used to symbolize the opposing concept. And I think it is like so I'm sure lots of people have, but I think I even read this in Campbell somewhere, that the sun, for instance, if you live in a more northern cold climate, the sun is going to be viewed as kind of a savior because he brings warmth and he brings with him the the growth of the crops and everything like that. Whereas if you live in a desert climate where the sun is harsh and the heat beats down on you and it kills the crops, it's going to be seen as something evil. So,
yeah,
no, it's true.
It explains the prevalence of moon deities in those arid climates.
Oh, Dean's right. That's why the hell is a burning place, because we get a Judeo-Christian concept of it, but a Norse hell is ice forever.
It seems like mythically the gods of desolation are the ones that kill the savior gods. It's Seth that kills Osiris, and he's god of the desert, and he's really not an all bad god. Okay, not in every way. He does protect travelers and things like that. But then you notice Jesus gets tempted. Where does he go? He goes out to the desert, okay, to be tempted of Satan. I think Satan actually, I don't think it's entirely accidental that Seth and Satan are associated.
And Sith.
Seth is, again, a sort of satanic religious figure by killing the god.
Yeah, that's what I should put on my Facebook page, is Atheist Jedi.
What I do find interesting is that Seth was an ass-headed god, and that there are a few Greek sources, I can't recall specifically which ones, I know Plutarch mentions it in some place, and then I think there were a few others, mention that the few people who have had access to the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, like I think there was an old legend that I think it's Plutarch or somebody recounts of when Alexander the Great visited Jerusalem, he was allowed to go behind the Holy of Holies because he was this powerful king and they didn't want to upset him. But they let him go back there and see what was behind there, and what they saw was this golden statue of an ass-headed god. And I thought that was kind of Seth was an ass-headed god. You got an ass-headed god. You claim your religion came out of Egypt from the Exodus. So, what's going on here?
Yeah, whether it's literally true.
There's a myth of Typhon or something. Isn't Typhon is that an Egyptian god that's associated with some destructive force?
Typhon is actually a Greek titan, but through syncretism, the Greeks identified him with Seth of Egypt.
Okay. Thank you. See, this is why we invite people like this to these hangouts. Well, this is actually a hangout. This was just something of an experiment. We're going to come back with a discussion with Raphael and Randall, and then we're going to try to go back to a monthly webcast. And Robert M. Price is one of the first people we would like to feature on our webcast. I have to do things, including moving and finishing the book that he wrote as a rebuttal to Bill O'Reilly, which is Killing History, and a rebuttal to O'Reilly's Killing Jesus.
That's the hysterical title.
And it's an interesting book. It gives you a lot of good biblical information. You don't read Robert Price talking about anything without learning something about the Bible. It's just that's how it.
Although it's not one of my favorite books by him, but it does put a lot of stuff in one place, because a lot of those discussions were spread out throughout several books, like The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and Jesus is Dead, and The Case Against the Case for Christ, I believe. Some of the Christmas theory and its problems, but mainly those three books. So it's all in one place. It's all point by point. So it makes it interesting and at least useful.
Okay, I got to mention that Dave Fitzgerald, he helped me found my first Christ myth study group online, which was Christian Mythicists. Okay, and everything we do with New Skeptics and all that grew out of that. And he just hit the book that we did that with was Nailed, and it just hit #1 in the atheist category on Amazon in audiobooks.
Nice.
Okay, so there's Fitzgerald, and he's nominating Neil Godfrey for that religious literacy award, which Neil Godfrey and Tim, his co-writer at Vridar. That's Vridar is an excellent source for lay persons to go to find out about the Christ myth and other topics concerning.
Yeah, we've had Tim Widowfield on one of the Bible Geek Hangouts, 1 or 2. Real nice guy, very nice guy.
Okay, yes, those are the 2 guys that are nominated, and I can't think of anybody better off the top of my head to be nominated for something like that.
Phil, if I can get in a plug, you mentioned David Fitzgerald. Actually, we're bringing him to Milwaukee. Mythicist Milwaukee's bringing him to speak in September on the 27th.
Plug the Cheesehead Town.
Along with, check this out, along with Killa Priest from Wu-Tang Clan is going to speak on, he's a mythicist, and he wants to start speaking publicly, and we're going to be one of his first opportunities to do so. A bunch of 50-year-old white dudes, or 35,
oh, really?
are going to hang out with Killa Priest from Wu-Tang Clan while he
That sounds incredibly punk.
Dude, it's Mandisa Thomas is also going to be there, Black Non-Believers, and hopefully getting a chapter of that group started in Milwaukee. So we're pumped about the movement in Milwaukee, man.
I'm stoked like Bram Stoker here.
Yeah, I only live like 40 minutes from the Wisconsin state line, but unfortunately, my born-again sister-in-law will be here that week.
Bring her along. Bring her along.
Oh, she would go.
My mom was just here. She dealt with it. She's a born-again.
Okay, so where were we? Roman cults. But really, no, there were a number, and there were some that were, in fact, the Orphic mysteries is something I need to look at a little bit. They were influential, as I understand, in first century Rome.
Yeah, from what little I've read on the Orphic mysteries, they incorporate a lot of more Eastern type of ideas, and that's kind of they're kind of the transition point for Eastern ideas to be mixed with Greek and Roman ideas. Like they were heavy into reincarnation, into and like rejection of the physical world, that there was this other kind of unseen realm that, you know, which we also see in like Plato's ideas, you know, of the celestial realms and realm of forms and all that stuff. But yeah, from what little I've read on them, they were incorporate a lot of Eastern stuff into their ideology.
Okay, and Orpheus is essentially Apollo. He's the sun god. There's Orpheus in Eurydice is one of the myths that he's in.
Right, and he was also in some traditions, like he was alleged to be the founder of the cult of Dionysus, and that's where we get that little thing on Freaking Gandy's book, where they found that alleged gem that says Orpheus becomes Bacchus, like, or he's reenacting Bacchus like in a passion play or something like that. It's supposed to be a little cruciform thing, and it says, you know, Orpheus becomes Bacchus.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah, but you know, I don't cite that like in anything I use, because I mean, number one, even even when it's dated by Freaking Gandy and other such people who believe it's authentic, it's only dated to like the 3rd century AD. But there was also controversy. It's been lost. Like after World War II, it was lost, so it's not up for examination anymore. And some people say it's a fake and whatnot. But it is interesting nonetheless.
Okay, we have Mithraism and other cults we could talk about, but let's ask Deanne about, say, the coffin text and how sources like that relate to the New Testament. Because I've read part of the coffin text, and boy, it's a lot like reading parts of the New Testament to me.
Well, that, and it's a lot like reading parts of the Old Testament too, and that it just kind of drags on and on and on about mundane shit. But yeah, definitely. There's obviously the biggest theme that runs throughout all the Egyptian funerary texts: coffin, pyramid, you know, Book of the Dead, and all that shit. is the idea of resurrection. And yes, physical resurrection. I know there's a lot of people, even Bart Ehrman, want to dispute that, but I've got a whole book on that, so I can refer people to that. But they definitely believe in physical resurrection, and that's the main overarching theme. But also you'll find in the coffin text are explicit references to what we talked about earlier, which is the idea that eating bread represents eating the flesh of the god. And in particular, this is Osiris. I'll have to reference it later if anybody wants to know the specific coffin text. But there is a coffin text that talks about how when Osiris died, ears of grain and barley grew out of his body, and then those ears were harvested and turned into bread. And then the deceased is supposed to eat that bread as a symbol of eating the flesh of Osiris, so that, like Osiris, they too can be resurrected. And this is something that dates back, the coffin texts date back to was it 2 millennia before Christ? So
figure the odds. Figure the odds that they would have a Eucharist. Well, yeah, and baptism, it doesn't seem to me a radical departure. It just seems to be full immersion. They weren't really able to line up full immersion baptism with any preceding group to the Christians that I know of. And with it being clearly stated that this is a death and essentially.
Right.
A death to the old life and a resurrection to the new.
That was actually a question I had posed in the Bible Geek Facebook group one time. I don't know if Price ever got around to being able to answer it, but I pointed out how it's interesting that if you read just the authentic Pauline text and nothing else, you just read that, in there you don't find any place where Paul says Jesus was buried in a tomb of earth, like that he was buried in a grave or in a rock tomb or anything like that. The only place where Paul references a burial of Christ is in the baptism passage, which I thought was kind of peculiar because the idea of being buried in water is a recurring theme, not just in Osiris myth, but you find that with Perseus or with the myth of Adonis. And there's several other myths that involve this idea of the protagonist being locked up in a coffin or chest of some sort and being buried in water. So
it's even a cognate sort of myth with the devastation by flood in the Bible, where you've got this destruction by flood, and then you have a restarting, mythically, a mythical restarting. Or whatever. So, hey, why don't we open the topic up to some other Christian groups if people want to talk about Old Testament or something like that. There's a lot of fascinating ideas coming out of that. What I'm finding now more as I study the Hebrews is that, and the Jews who then become the Jews, is that the Jews are not terribly different from their pagan neighbors in their actual general lifestyle. And for early Christianity, having 3 gods like it does in a henotheistic pantheon, that would have, as Dr. Price has said, looked like polytheism to a pagan. And so when I look at Christianity, I'm looking at it as the organism that won out in that environment back there. And it did because it had some important things that allowed it to be usable, at least once it was all put together. And so we have them doing that with the book of Acts, essentially creating a false history. Now, would you not agree that that's what that is, that book of Acts is an invented history, therefore just a religious tradition?
Yeah, I would concur with that for the most part. I haven't really studied the composition of the Book of Acts, the textual criticism aspect of it, all that much. But I do know that Price has pointed out that it has a lot of parallels with the Bacchae by who was it?
Euripides. Bacchae.
Yeah, Euripides. Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, Price did the exegesis on that, where you can see the dialogue in Paul's Epiphany is taken from the Bacchae, which was a popular play of the time. And this is one of the things that shows that educated people of the time of Christianity would have realized that some of this stuff just wasn't true that they were reading. Okay, they weren't entirely stupid people, and they were familiar with this other literature.
Exactly.
Yeah, there was that line there from the Vision of Christ, where Christ asks Paul, "Why do you kick against the goads?" which is an exact quote from Bacchae.
Yeah, Exactly, and in fact, I have that in Christian Mythicist Facebook group, and those are two things that people can connect to: Christian Mythicist Facebook group and New Skeptics Facebook group, and we talk about all this stuff in both of those groups. But the Christian Mythicist is more for the biblical student, that sort of thing.
Also, anybody's welcome to join the Bible Geek Listeners group on Facebook, which Dr. Price also frequents.
Exactly, and I myself frequent it, so there we go.
I know.
Okay.
But the question of Acts, though, recently they had the completion of the Acts seminar, which is basically a continuation of the Jesus seminar type, same scholars, and now it's becoming somewhat mainstream among the more liberal faction and more critical faction of New Testament scholarship and academia, that the book of Acts should have just began with once upon a time, basically.
Yeah, it's funny. Some of that stuff was kind of anticlimactic through the Jesus seminar and all of that for me. I don't know. I guess I expected the New Testament scholars to be more demanding than they were.
What's also funny is that in the book of Acts, it's almost like they kind of give you a wink and nod that they are indeed borrowing a lot or were influenced by the Greek poetry, because there is the incident Mars Hill where Paul explicitly talks about that. Like, he cites the Greek poets, and he quotes from a few others, not just Euripides, but he quotes from I forget the names of the other guys, but the guy who wrote the poem on the Cretans, and then who else was it? There was another one that was a poem about Zeus, and Paul quotes that when he's at Mars Hill preaching to the Athenians, and he's like, "See,
really?
even your own poets declare the gospel that I'm preaching." So it's kind of like a little tongue-in-cheek, wink and nod kind of thing there.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I was
also
to talk to Rick Carrier for a minute about the Q source here in San Diego a couple months ago. So that was pretty interesting.
What do you have to say about that?
Well, he was just saying that, he sees it as a potential group of documents that existed, or a group of sources, and that's what I've come to see it as a source. And so there is a group of people that goes around that source also.
Another thing that surprised me about these guys in the Acts seminar was that they are very accepting of the thesis of the scholar Dennis Ronald MacDonald, who wrote several books about the influence of the Homeric epics on Gospels and Acts. So he's very prominent in a lot of the conclusions of the Acts seminar.
Okay. Deanne, why don't you grab this discussion and take it somewhere?
I was actually trying to Google Ronald McDonald's name because I'm like, oh, with a name like that, I've got to see this guy.
Dennis Ronald MacDonald, MAC.
But yeah, just further touching upon the Acts thing. I mean, yeah, the parallels. I mean, these are probably in the list that you've got posted on your group. I haven't actually read over that in a while, but other things that come to mind is how, like, in that play, Dionysus is persecuted for claiming that he's the son of a god. There's the tongues of fire above his followers, the Bacchae. It says like they have a flame of fire above their head that did not burn them. There's all kinds of things like that I think are very conspicuous.
Yeah, and plus, if we're talking about the Bacchae, we get to talk about the Bacchanalia and what that was, because in fact, Paul is a source for a lot of people when they want to talk about why the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. They go to, I think it's Romans or Galatians 1. And there's something in there, and what Paul's actually talking about there is the Bacchanalia and the women. It's because what happens is ordinary Roman women get together and they have sex in this wild drinking orgy. Okay, and I think that's an interesting thing also about Christianity, is that it seems to me to some extent to be a moralistic movement and a unifying movement for its time religiously, bringing all sorts of people to monotheism, which is at least a step to becoming a more free thinker for that time. you know, very important step. So anyway.
But also, the Bacchanalia was a winter solstice festival, which I know that the whole winter solstice and Christmas thing isn't actually in the canonized New Testament itself, but it's still a major theme in Christianity. So it's interesting that one of these gods who has a major influence on the Christian mythology also had a festival that took place at the winter solstice time.
Right. The date ends up being adjusted in the Roman case for the cult of Saul Invictus to line Jesus's birthday up with that. But that's just Christian tradition stuff. It really doesn't have anything to do with the Bible.
Right. Although I did pose, I think I did pose that question to Robert Price one time. That there was some obscure reference in Irenaeus where he's refuting the Gnostics and the idea that Jesus was only something that is actually biblical, but Irenaeus wants to fight against it with the idea that Jesus was in his 30s when he died, and Irenaeus argues that Jesus was actually in his 50s. But one of the things that Irenaeus brings up in that passage was this idea, I think he says it specifically, it was the Valentinians who believed that Jesus was both born, that his whole ministry only lasted 1 year, and that he was born and died in the 12th month. That's all he says, though, the 12th month. So he may have been referring to the 12th Jewish month. But if it was the 12th month on the Roman calendar, that would have been December. So it's, in effect, Irenaeus was saying that the Valentinians believed that Jesus was born in December. So, there's that little obscure reference that would have at least rolled that back into the 2nd century.
Right. Yeah, it's great that we know about the Valentinians and the other Christian cults, which is what they were of the 2nd century, with wildly different beliefs. And then, so we're at a point when we discover Christianity, that's what we have. But by the time Constantine dies, give it another 20 years, and they'll cut your throat in Rome for not being a Christian.
And not that they probably didn't want to do that before Constantine, they just didn't have the, I guess, legal authority.
Yeah. So Constantine does stuff, but basically by threatening to kill a lot of people and by killing some small group of people, I think, get killed in the creation of the Bible, don't they? Well, I mean, you have Irenaeus, you have the heresiologists, and basically people start dropping like flies after that, don't they? If the Trinity. Once the doctrine gets set up for the Trinity that the Catholics subscribe to, then anybody who's a Unitarian or something becomes fair game. I realize that's 4th century. But apparently, okay, Christianity comes from some conservative group of believers in Rome in its origin. Isn't that true? Isn't that likely? I mean, I realize you can't pinpoint where it came from, but it seems to me there's this group that wants orthodoxy.
Well, yeah. If you mean Christianity as we know it now, then yeah, I could concur with that point.
Well, I mean, even the pagans, from the way I understand it, are achieving something of a monotheism in their beliefs. A lot of them are realizing that it's a bit silly to have 100 gods to explain phenomena. They're finding it doesn't work out. They've got a lot of overlapping gods in the pagan belief systems. And so I think the pagans are even using in speech where they're referring to the gods as God, as a singular word. I bet that's something I don't know the answer to. I'd really like to get it.
Don't you think there's a sense that the people who knew that there weren't any gods but wanted to control society with it knew it was easier to sell one god? It was clearly obvious that there weren't there isn't a god in everything.
And here's what I see: I see Jehovah as this very clear model for the Christians and to create the Jesus character. Okay, Jesus is the son of Jehovah, and they use Jehovah as a model to do what Jehovah had done back in the day, which was turn the many gods into one God in Israel. And what was happening where the Romans were grabbing the orthodoxy that the Jews had, because this normalized their societies. Jews would actually follow the rules that were in the books, and the pagan world had nothing like that. It simply had its old myths, and it was much more personal thing, religion. There was no orthodoxy.
Well, more or less.
Little orthodoxy.
I mean, there are some stories in later books that on into the Common Era that talk about how Romulus allegedly authored, like, you know, X amount of books, like hundreds of books about laws and shit that you needed to follow. And so you know, there were certain groups within the pagan world that did have, like, you know, sets of laws and scriptures that they would follow that I guess could kind of be parallel to how Jews followed their law as well. But yeah, I guess more or less your point stands.
And the Romans, in fact, probably rightly saw the Jews as very picayunish about rules and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, they had been admiring the whole Greco-Roman world from Plato onward, had been admiring what the Jews were doing, and were in fact influenced by these ideas, even in their own. I think even in their own mythology, there could have been diffusion back and forth between Hebrews and Greeks from the ancient period. Some of the stories, in fact, Robert Price does work on it that shows parallels going on. And sorry, I don't want to get into a parallelomania discussion here, okay? But
I think it's an obvious evolution, just like atheism is the obvious evolution from monotheism. Pantheism was going to die as educated society, Greek and Roman. You know, the Romans learned from the Greeks and realized that they had a lot of stuff on the ball, so they followed them down the road. And as it all became clear to the leaders of these societies that there wasn't many gods, it just became much easier to sell to the masses. Here's your simple rules to follow. Here's your one God. You don't see him, just like you didn't see any of the other ones, but he's really there. It's okay. That's the cynical atheist's take on it.
I'm trying to figure out Mariana's acronyms and abbreviations. I'm not sure what they mean. I know some naughty versions of what she's writing, but I'm not sure.
Who? Okay. Well, we've got dead air here again, folks. We were going to wrap it up somewhere around 1:30. And it's 1:10. So
well, we can keep going. I was also trying to figure out what the abbreviations were. All right. But yeah, I had actually found the name while Googling around here, the name of the elixir I had mentioned earlier that was used in the Mysteries of Eleusis, and it was called Kikion, evidently. And it says that, yeah, it was a mixture of mainly water, barley, and grated cheese. And it says that when these were brewed together, they created a psychoactive compound. So, and it says this is mentioned like in the Homeric epics and stuff. The usage of this elixir,
which was pretty much like Googling something on the internet for back in those days.
Oh, you mean like to get revelations of knowledge or some shit?
Yeah,
probably, possibly.
No, and in fact, I like to point out to people that you have a great difference in the modern world where scientists really understand how a lot of things work. And back in the ancient times, if you had a myth, it was pretty hard to differentiate it from reality because no one had a good source of knowledge like we have in the modern world. So therefore, when we're looking at these old things, we have to realize that we can't even think like these people thought. They were, by and large, quite, illiterate, ignorant people back then. It was unfortunate. Life was short and dreary.
Oh, religion to me was proto-science too. At that point, I mean, that was their best guess. You know.
Yeah, all that great science they did when they were writing the Bibles with the firmament in heaven that's the top of the tent that's holding up heaven up there, and everything goes around the flat earth. And yeah, and in fact they continue to get scientific, I think, even in the Logos concept, the concept that Jesus is the Word and that he is this divine sort of creative principle. And this is what John comes out with at the beginning of his gospel. Jesus is the co-creator with Jehovah. Jehovah speaks things into existence. Jesus actually gets his hands dirty and makes them.
Well, that reminds me of something you said earlier, Phil, about what the heck was it? Oh, we were reading in the Biblical Criticism Book Club, which we do Sunday nights, and we have a hangout on that on a book. And the book we were reading was by Hermann Dettering, and it was called The Fabricated Paul. But the final chapter he took the position that heresies, Gnosticism, things like that, were actually the innovative forces in that Orthodoxy appropriated the good ideas that it liked as it was persecuting the heretics. So things like, what would be a good example? Well, even some of the writings, the basic earliest New Testament writings, were appropriated by Orthodoxy after some finagling. But it was they didn't represent the creative force in society. It was the people that the fringe, the hangers out, the ones outside of society.
I know, kind of touching on that point, it is interesting that none of the heresiologists made a fuss about having quote-unquote ownership over the books of the New Testament until after Marcion. Before Marcion, nobody really made an uproar about whether this book was authentic or belonged in the New Testament or whatever. But after Marcion, then suddenly Irenaeus and Tertullian and all these guys come out of the woodwork saying, no, 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 we have the original version of Luke, not Marcion. You know?
Yeah, that's the whole hangout in itself.
I understand the Mithraists converted because they were largely Mithraists because it was the kind of organization a professional guy could get ahead in, and you know, and then when Christianity came in, they all just left it like they were never in it. Now is that true? I don't know. I mean, we can verify that, but I wouldn't be surprised because it was very much about social rank and
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say.
It was a guy's club too. It wasn't a church. You couldn't take the wife and kids. You know?
Exactly. I was going to say they kind of shot themselves in the foot in that way, in that they didn't really proselytize or evangelize. It wasn't one come all. It was very exclusionary. So.
Yeah. Well, hey, John, you've done a lot of great studies. What are you looking at nowadays?
Oh, geez, I'm spread pretty thin. One of the main projects I'm working on is trying to digitize the book by Paul Louis Couchot called Creation of Christ. And he does a reconstruction of Marcion's Gospel, which is very fascinating to work with, because he gives all the sources, Tertullian, Epiphanius, sorry, Adamantius, and guys like that, per line, per verse. So it's just fascinating to actually go through the reconstruction because you'll learn a lot doing that. That's doing that for Frank Zindler at American Atheist, so, but it's taken forever. There's a lot of errors in the book, you know, miscitations and all kinds of mistakes.
Frank Zindler has some great interviews on YouTube that people can check out.
Yeah, he does. I was just watching one the other day on the Gnostics, a part of it, because I didn't have a whole lot of time. But yeah, he's a real nice guy. I've worked with him before. I've done digitizations of most of Dr. Price's books that were published by American Atheist. So if you get it on Kindle or whatever, I probably did it.
Huh. Great to know.
But I have to sign off right now. Unfortunately, I cannot hang out any longer. Got some stuff to do. So I appreciate the invitation. I really enjoyed speaking with you guys.
Excellent. We're very glad to have you.
Good stuff.
Yeah, thanks. And let me know when you guys are going to do it again. Take care.
Take it easy.
Bye.
Have a good Memorial Day, as those in the States.
All right. Where's he at? That he's not in the States?
I think he's in the Midwest somewhere in Illinois.
Oh, that's right. He said
Northern Illinois, in fact. Actually, I grew up near where he is at. I mean,
I can tell by your accent.
Within 100 miles or something.
I can tell by your accent that you did. That's hilarious. DM, what's your story? I didn't hear your name. What's
DN Boswell, and I just, I live around Chattanooga, and I'm just a former fundamentalist Baptist, just kind of telling my story, relating the knowledge that led to my deconversion. So,
we got the podcast on Sundays, and we're looking for guests here. July's wide open. Phil, Sean wanted me to ask if you'd be on, and Deanna, I love the way your mind works too, from what I hear.
I'd be happy to do it.
Right.
Oh, sure. Sounds cool.
Those guys are the mythicists. Like I say, I'm repping the group. I'm the podcast host, and I'm a local atheist guy. But I don't have that kind of the research that you guys come up with is fascinating to me. It's so we're
right. I mean, I'm just a reader of books. I'm a I've got a couple years of college, and I'm a reader of books, and so I'm not an expert, but you'll normally often hear me referencing an expert that I'm quoting, which is what you're supposed to do, and this is, a good way for the public to interact with scholarship. Scholarship doesn't have the tight control that science does. We don't control for bias in scholarship. Therefore, scholarship is open to a lot of interpretation, and you can't go by the numbers. When somebody says, well, a majority of people believe this, I'm just thinking, I really don't care. I couldn't care if it was 1 or 99.
Yeah.
You can either really prove what you're saying, or you can either reasonably prove what you're saying, or you can't. Is what it comes down to. And it's unfortunate because people will sometimes wander off into theory land without telling you that they've done that. And so that's what I consider a good author, is someone where I can tell when they're making a claim and when they're not. And I can tell, to a reasonable degree whether they're backing up what they're saying.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of my issues with the whole mythicist movement is that just what you said, scholarship's always going to be debatable, and no one's ever going to be able to prove these things, and as different people go off on different tangents with what they extrapolate out of their theories, out of their research. There's this kind of infighting, and no one's ever really going to agree, so that kind of frustrates me, but, the people who are looking into this, to me, are the spearhead. This is the cutting edge of the movement. This is what's
it is. And in fact, these are the most germane topics intellectually to the movement, if you ask me, because when you look at the Bible, and if you look at it objectively, you have to see it as artworks created by unknown people. And we know for a fact we have numerous different people creating this Jesus of Nazareth, because they're creating different Jesuses in different places.
And the salient point for me is that religious people should be able to garner, knowledge and wisdom from this. To me, the metaphor is the beauty of the faith and the myth. And to take it literally, you lose all the magic. The storytellers knew it was a myth, and it's how they got their point across, and they understood the power of it. These literalists, these creationists, these boobs that think that the Bible is a literal story, no one ever talked to us about that in the 70s. Science was cool, and the Bible was a metaphor. That was it where I grew up. And now I come to the Midwest, and I'm old, and I meet all these young people who think that Genesis is some kind of literal depiction of events. It's embarrassing. It's 2015. This is America. So, to me, if you really care about the faith, then the exploration of the mythology behind it should be revealing and beautiful. It shouldn't be threatening.
Right. A lot of people don't realize that Genesis, if you read Genesis, okay, the Christians are very dishonest about Genesis. To start with, Genesis, the account of creation in Genesis 2, chapter 2, contradicts certain points of the one in Genesis 1. They were a church, they taught out, they didn't even have to use this, both copies, but they did. Okay, it wasn't about a literal interpretation from the beginning. This is creating a poetic image for you to look at. And so the things you say are not scientifically true. For instance, there's not a first two human beings. This is what a lot of people have to learn. We can tell by fossil evidence that there isn't this first two human beings. You go from something simpler to something a little more evolved.
That part we know.
That's how evolution works. And that we know happened, and we know the stars weren't created one day and then you get water a couple other days. Stars have to actually die, and that takes billions of years, okay? So 6 days of creation are there, so you get Saturday off. Okay, that's why the 6 days of creation are there, because they even had to make God take a day off just to get a day off for people back then. So such was the labor law condition of the day.
Good stuff. Well,
but touching on the point that Rob just made, I think it was Price who kind of attested to that when he was in that film, The God Who Wasn't There, there was a scene where Price had said that it was after he had finally realized that all of it was just mythology and that it was symbolic, and when he grew an appreciation for that artistic side of the mythology, that then he became a churchgoer again. After he had already deconverted and become an atheist, he started going back to church because he had a newfound appreciation for the culture and the mythology. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in fact, I can see like he does that, and he's talked about how he does it like other people might go to a movie, and he pretends the movie is true for the time he's in there. And that's his right to do that. But what we find with Dr. Price is, you know, since he's not a supernaturalist, he doesn't seem to fall for all these lame arguments that other scholars do. Metaphysical arguments and crap. He just doesn't wander into metaphysically shaky territory in his work.
Yeah, I think that's important. What you said, you gravitate.
Well, that's the bias. There's this great bias of that we live in the mystical world that Neoplatonists dreamed of back in the 2nd century or something. It is what it seems like to me. It's in the Bible. It's a very mystical, magical view of the world that I think kind of cheats Christians when people get quite orthodox about the faith and they don't see it. Just as the stories of human beings, but they take it literally, they do lose the beauty of what it actually is. They can't objectively see it because they've reified it. They've turned it into a concrete image of what their God is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This was awesome, man. It's almost 1:30.
Oh, yeah. Time flies.
3:30 by me.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and wind this one down before it gets boring. What do you say? And we'll just have another good one. I mean, this one went fine, and I'll go ahead and maybe use these things like as I'm using this one as just you know, we could work out technical problems or stuff like that before we go ahead on with the show, that sort of thing.
Outstanding, man. Invite me back. I'll be happy.
All right, excellent. And yeah, and I really appreciate the invitation too. Is that MYTHICIST Milwaukee you're with?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I've been following you guys for a long time, and I think you do good, you know, webcasts and stuff. So I'm all excited about that.
The roof. We're actually working with a local director to do a new kind of a revamped zeitgeist type of maybe just correct some of the mistakes and.
Yeah. Well, let me correct the main one. Okay, Osiris is the only one you have archaeology for, and Richard Carrier points this out in one of his videos, and that's the case. You can line Jesus up as the Osiris myth, and accurately so, and dying, rising, Savior God. Yeah. But the rest of them, forget it. Nobody meets all the criteria that Magic Jesus possesses, and that's the name of the book I'm working on, and it may take 10 years to finish. We don't know. But no, I'm just saying. I'm just kidding, but I hope I'm kidding.
Maybe religion will be dead on its own by then.
Yeah, and Dave Fitzgerald's working on his book, the Jesus Mything in Action. That's going to be his next book.
I love it.
And I can't wait for that to come out. The Mormons didn't really interest me because. What is it? You can disprove Mormonism with a DNA test, so it gets kind of silly. Okay, you all have a good one, and thanks for coming.
Take it easy, guys.
It was fun.